What's the point of all this if I can't save anyone? Those were the words of a renowned doctor, sitting alone in his small apartment, surrounded by awards and diplomas that no longer meant anything. After abandoning an emergency surgery to save the life of a homeless man, he lost everything: his job, his reputation, his purpose. But what he didn't expect was that sometime later the daughter of the man he saved would show up at his door with a request that would change everything. What could she possibly want? How will he react after having his life completely destroyed? The unexpected request places the doctor in front of a decision that could redefine his future. Stay until the end, because the conclusion of this story is surprising and emotional. What he will say and decide could change everything once again. With a trembling hand, he held a crumpled resignation letter. His eyes wandered over the words he had read and reread countless times, as if with each new reading, he hoped to find a different explanation for what had happened. In his other hand, an almost empty bottle of whiskey rested, bringing a false sense of comfort that evaporated with every sip. Mark brought the bottle to his lips once more, the liquid burning his throat as he felt the unbearable weight of failure. Mark Reynolds sat on the cold floor of his small New York apartment, surrounded by silent chaos. Cardboard boxes were stacked in random corners, filled with crumpled papers and old folders. The shelves, once a symbol of his brilliant career as a surgeon, now resembled monuments to a distant life. Framed diplomas and trophies from medical conferences accumulated a fine layer of dust, as if reflecting the current state of his existence. For Mark, all of it felt like a distant echo of a man he no longer recognized. Suddenly his voice broke the silence of the apartment. "What's the point of all this if I can't save anyone?" The echo of his words seemed to get lost in the emptiness around him. He threw the letter onto the table, his fingers trembling slightly. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment, feeling pulled into a nearly physical solitude. That question hung in the air, unanswered. What was life if he could no longer do what he did best? If he could no longer save lives? The memory of how it all began surged in his mind, a vivid flashback he revisited often. The hospital was in complete chaos that night. The operating room buzzed with voices and swift movements. Mark was ready to perform a complicated surgery when, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted a blood-covered man being rushed through the emergency entrance. Something in his instincts pulled him outside, as if his body acted before his mind could process the situation. Ignoring the warnings from his colleagues and the responsibility of the surgery underway, Mark dashed out of the operating room, his heart racing. The man was a homeless person, clearly gravely injured. Blood soaked through his tattered clothes, and his eyes were closed, as if he was already on the brink of death. Mark knelt beside him, immediately beginning resuscitation procedures without a second thought. The shouts of his colleagues echoed in the background, pleading for him to return to the operating room, but he ignored them. The homeless man was alive, and Mark knew that every second counted. He worked tirelessly, his mind focused solely on saving the life before him. Then, everything happened too quickly. The hospital director burst through the door, his face furious. Mark was still crouched there, his hands covered in blood, while the director reprimanded him in front of everyone. "You violated the protocols, Mark. This was a complete irresponsibility," the director shouted, his voice full of disdain. The coldness in his eyes was sharper than any word. Meanwhile, the homeless man began to breathe more steadily, his life saved. But the price Mark would pay for this would be far too high. Cutting back to the present, the scene shifted abruptly. Mark found himself signing the papers of his resignation. His gaze was empty, distant, as he watched his career, his life as a doctor, crumble before his eyes. The pen scratched the paper, and there ended what he believed to be his life's mission. The sound of the doorbell pulled Mark back to the present, yanking him out of the whirlwind of memories that always tormented him. He hesitated for a moment, staring at the door. Who could it be? He wasn't expecting anyone, and in truth, he didn't want to see anyone. Reluctantly, he rose slowly, still feeling the heaviness of alcohol and emotional fatigue weighing down on him. When he opened the door, he was surprised to see a young woman standing before him, Caroline. Her eyes were red, and the tears barely contained on her face said it all. She stood there, silent for a moment, trying to find the right words. Mark observed the scene with a mix of confusion and indifference, his mind still trapped in the turmoil of his own problems. I just wanted to thank you," Caroline finally said, her voice choked. "My dad, Julian, he was dying that night, and you saved him. You brought him back." Tears began to flow down her cheeks, and she wiped her face, attempting to compose herself. "I don't know what would have happened if it weren't for you." Mark remained still, his empty gaze fixed on her. He felt her words, but they seemed to bounce off the emotional barrier he had erected. "It doesn't matter anymore," he said, his voice cold. "I've lost everything." The silence that followed was dense, almost unbearable. Caroline stood there, unsure of what to say, but finally stepped forward, gently placing her hands over Mark's. Her touch made him shiver slightly. "You haven't lost everything," she said softly. "You saved a life. You saved my dad." Mark looked at their joined hands but said nothing. Silence enveloped them once more, but this time something had shifted. Something deeper was about to begin. The silence between Mark and Caroline hung heavy in the air as she pulled her hands away from his, feeling the coldness emanating from him. But Caroline wasn't ready to give up. She took a deep breath, trying to find a way to reach the wounded man in front of her. Her father, Julian, and Mark were so alike, two broken souls who had lost everything they loved. "My dad, Julian, he used to be someone else," Caroline began, her voice soft yet laden with emotion. "He was a musician, an incredible musician." Mark looked at her, intrigued. There was something in her voice that captured his attention, even as he resisted the urge to admit it. "He played jazz. You should have seen him. He was brilliant. There was light in everything he did. But when my mom died, something inside him broke." Caroline paused, her voice faltering for a moment. "He tried, you know? He tried to be strong, but alcohol and drugs consumed him. That's how he ended up on the streets." Mark turned his face away, struggling against the emotions that began to bubble within him. He had heard stories like this before, so many times, and they all seemed to end the same way, badly. He swallowed hard, avoiding Caroline's gaze. "I've seen this before," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "And the ending is never good." Caroline, however, was not willing to accept that cynicism. Her gaze remained steady, even though her heart felt shattered into 1,000 pieces. "The ending hasn't come yet," she asserted with a quiet confidence. Mark finally looked at her, and for a moment he saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. A hope he couldn't understand. How could she believe so much in a man who seemed to have given up on himself? Caroline's words echoed in Mark's mind as he sank into the couch of his apartment. The image of Julian, the man he had saved, blended with his own reflection in the mirror. He was as broken as Julian. The weight of his own failures began to suffocate him. As Caroline spoke, memories of that fateful night in the hospital surged back with full force. He remembered the emptiness he felt when he signed his resignation, as if something inside him had died at that moment. The weight of his colleagues' criticisms, the feeling of failure as a doctor. Mark was no longer the hero people expected him to be, and that was what haunted him. He had saved lives, but now he was just a lost man, adrift. What more could he offer someone? As Caroline's voice continued to resonate, Mark felt a pang of panic. There were unsettling parallels between Julian and him. Both had lost everything, both drowned in the consequences of their losses, and now both stood on the edge of an abyss. He was on the brink of losing himself completely, just as Julian had done. He used to say that when he played, everything made sense. Caroline continued, unaware of the internal turmoil within Mark. But after my mom died, everything fell apart. The music, life, everything lost its meaning. The similarity between Julian and his own downfall was too painful for Mark to ignore. He remembered how he used to feel in the operating rooms, with another person's life in his hands, and how all of that had unraveled. A feeling of despair began to wash over Mark. He could see his own reflection in Caroline's eyes, and it terrified him. Julian and he were reflections of the same impending disaster. What if he ended up like Julian? What was stopping him from following the same dark path? Caroline, noticing the conflict forming on Mark's face, knew she couldn't stop there. She had touched something in him, even if he wouldn't admit it. Her voice softened, but was now filled with urgency. My dad, he's showing signs of recovery. Since you saved him, he's been trying. Caroline leaned forward, desperation creeping into her words. But he can't do this alone. He still needs someone to believe in him. Mark looked at Caroline, his eyes darkening with a mix of pain and doubt. He didn't want to get involved. He couldn't get involved. The burden of another life in his hands was too heavy for him to bear at that moment. He shook his head slightly, trying to push away what he knew Caroline was asking. I'm not the hero you think I am, he murmured, his voice weak, nearly breaking. I can't do this. Caroline didn't look away, keeping her eyes fixed on him, her expression filled with determination. You don't have to be a hero, she replied, her voice calm yet firm. You just need to be there. That's what he needs, someone who won't give up on him. Mark felt the weight of Caroline's words sink into him like a stone. He wasn't the man she imagined, but there was something in her eyes, something in the way she pleaded without really pleading, that disarmed him. He tried to find a way to refuse, to distance himself from the responsibility she was placing on his shoulders, but he couldn't. Caroline's determination and hope hit him like a wave. He sighed deeply, the emotional exhaustion overwhelming him, and murmured, almost in surrender. Mark was nervous as he stood in front of the hostel. It was an old, worn-down building with dirty windows and graffiti-covered walls, a grim reflection of the lives many there led. He hesitated for a few seconds before pushing open the rusty metal door. The interior was even more depressing than the exterior. The smell of mold and weary bodies permeated the air. The atmosphere was heavy, a combination of hopelessness and resignation. Every corner seemed to whisper stories of shattered lives. He walked down the narrow hallway until he found the small room where Julian was. Mark didn't know what to expect. Ever since Caroline had left his apartment, something inside him had urged him to make this visit. Perhaps it was guilt, or maybe it was the empathy he had been trying so hard to suppress. He didn't know. All he knew was that he needed to be there. When he entered the dimly lit room, he saw Julian sitting on a thin, worn mattress in the corner, his shoulders hunched, his gaze lost. He seemed smaller, more fragile than Mark remembered. The man who had once been full of life and talent was now curled up as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Julian slowly lifted his eyes when he heard Mark's footsteps, and for a brief moment they sparkled with recognition. "Did you come to save me?" Julian asked, his voice weak, almost inaudible. There was something in that question that pierced Mark's heart. It wasn't simple gratitude. It was a mix of surprise and uncertainty, as if Julian couldn't believe he was still worthy of being saved. Mark hesitated before responding. Part of him wanted to maintain emotional distance, not get involved more than he already was. "I was just doing my job," he said, his voice dry, but he knew that wasn't the whole truth. Not anymore. Julian looked down as if ashamed of his own situation. He didn't need to say anything for Mark to perceive the depth of his humiliation. The tension between them was almost palpable, as if both were trying to navigate a minefield of unspoken emotions. Mark took another step toward Julian, feeling uncomfortably vulnerable in that moment. For the first time, he wasn't the self-assured doctor. He was just a man unsure if he was ready to face that shared pain. Julian began to speak slowly, as if the words had been trapped inside him for a long time. He told Mark about his past, but not in a proud way that someone speaks of their achievements. It was a narrative laden with regret and sadness. He spoke of his career as a musician, how he played saxophone in jazz clubs all over New York. His eyes, which had been cloudy and distant, began to shine a bit as he recalled the days when music was his life. "When I played, everything made sense. It was like I was in another world, where nothing else mattered, only the music and me," Julian said, a melancholic smile appearing on his face, but soon the smile faded. "And then, when she left me—" He stopped, his eyes welling up. "I lost everything, Mark. She was everything to me, my wife, my muse. When she died, I lost the music, lost the meaning of everything." Mark listened in silence, struggling to control his own emotions. He realized it wasn't just Julian's story that affected him. It was the fact that in many ways he too had lost everything. Not a wife, but his career, his identity, his purpose. He knew what it felt like to be empty, as if the ground had vanished beneath his feet. Julian continued, now with tears streaming down his face. He raised his hands as if playing an invisible saxophone, crafting an imaginary melody in the air. Mark could almost hear the music, and for the first time he saw beauty in that pain, a beauty that only those who have survived the worst could comprehend. Julian stopped, his voice trembling as he said, "I lost her, and I lost myself too." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to say something, anything that could ease Julian's pain, but the words seemed inadequate. There was something deeply moving about the broken man before him, someone still holding on to fragments of who he used to be. Mark realized that, like Julian, he too was trying to piece together his own fragments. And in that moment, he knew he couldn't simply turn his back on it all. The following days brought more frequent encounters between Mark and Caroline. As they discussed what they could do to help Julian, something began to change between them. It wasn't just the fact that they were working together for a common cause, it was the connection forming from their own pains and vulnerabilities. At a cafe near the hostel, they sat at a table by the window, watching the city bustle outside. Caroline seemed more hopeful with each passing day, and her optimism began to rub off on Mark, despite his internal resistances. She spoke about Julian with unwavering determination, describing the small advances he was making as if each sober day was a monumental victory. And in a way, it was. Mark, on the other hand, began to open up more to Caroline. He wasn't someone who easily spoke about his own struggles, but something about the way Caroline listened to him without judgment made him feel safe. He confessed hesitantly that since his dismissal, he hadn't been able to find a reason to move forward. "I lost everything, Caroline. I lost who I was, and until now I can't see how I can become anything again." Caroline fell silent for a moment, processing Mark's words. Then she reached across the table and, with a gentle touch, held his hand. "Maybe you found a reason now," she said, her voice soft but full of meaning. Mark looked at her, confused for a moment. "What do you mean?" "Julian?" Caroline replied simply, "You saved him, Mark, and now you can be part of his recovery. That's not insignificant. Maybe saving a life was just the beginning." Those words echoed in Mark's mind. He looked at Caroline's hands holding his, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a new purpose in this journey. Perhaps Julian's recovery could also mean his own recovery. Mark and Caroline met at a modest cafe, one of their routines after the meetings with Julian. The conversation flowed more easily with each passing day as the trust between them grew stronger. However, that afternoon, Mark felt he needed to address something that had been building in his mind since their interactions began. Caroline's future. "Have you ever thought about pursuing a career in therapy?" Mark asked, his voice calm but laden with intention. Caroline looked at him in surprise. She had never seriously considered the idea, although she had always felt inclined to help others. "I never really thought about it," she admitted, stirring her coffee and averting her gaze. Mark smiled, his empathy stemming from his own experiences as a doctor. "Caroline, you have something special. When you talk about your father, about Julian, I see that you view him in a way that goes beyond the pain and chaos. You see the person he used to be, and the person he can still become. That's rare." Caroline blushed slightly at the compliment, but before she could respond, Mark continued. "As a doctor, I always believed I had to have all the answers, and when I realized I didn't, it began to destroy me inside. But I saw something in each patient, a spark. And you have that, Caroline. You can see that spark in people." Mark's words resonated deeply with Caroline. She hadn't expected someone she admired so much to see something so valuable in her. She felt inspired but also nervous. "I don't know if I'm capable. I don't know if I'm strong enough." Mark, sensing the hesitation in her voice, leaned in a little closer. "You're already strong. You're taking care of your father even after everything he's been through. It's not about having all the answers. It's about being present, listening, and believing that you already do." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. For the first time, Caroline felt a growing confidence in her own abilities. Mark truly believed in her, and that sparked a desire within her to believe as well. The idea for the community event emerged during one of the many conversations Mark and Caroline had while walking through the city. Caroline frequently emphasized the importance of giving homeless individuals not just temporary help, but also a chance to be heard, to share their stories. Initially skeptical, Mark began to see the value in that idea, but over time his hesitation transformed into something greater. "This event, it wouldn't just be for them," Mark said, his thoughts forming into words as he gazed at the city skyline. "It's for us too, for the community as a whole." Caroline watched him closely, noticing the transformation happening within Mark. He was rediscovering what it meant to be a doctor, but in a different way. No longer just about saving lives in a physical sense, but about helping to save souls, reconnecting people. "If everyone there is heard, if even one story is told, maybe we can plant something bigger," Caroline suggested, optimism shining in her eyes. Mark agreed, feeling a bit more animated than usual. "Yes, because healing isn't just in medicine, it's in human connection. It's in empathy and compassion, something I lost sight of." They began planning the details, an event where homeless individuals could share their stories, play music, and express themselves in ways society rarely allowed. A space where Julian, for instance, could play his saxophone again, and perhaps for a brief moment remember who he was before everything fell apart. As the plans took shape, Mark realized that this wasn't just about others. The event would serve as a form of redemption for him too, a way to reconnect with himself, with what he believed in, and to heal the part of him that had been broken when he was forced to leave his medical career. As preparations for the event progressed, Mark began to feel waves of resistance coming from an unexpected place: his former medical colleagues. He knew that by choosing to engage so actively with the homeless community, he was, in a sense, breaking away from the elitist circle he had been part of for so long. Still, the criticism that started to come his way was harsher than he had anticipated. During a quick visit to the hospital to pick up some papers, he was approached by a doctor he had worked with for years. It was someone Mark deeply respected, but who now looked at him with disdain. "I heard you're getting involved in community projects," the doctor said with a clear tone of disapproval. "Is that what's left for you, Mark? Mixing with the homeless?" Mark felt a knot in his stomach. He was already struggling with his own insecurities, and his colleague's words cut deep. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. Part of him wanted to walk away, to avoid confrontation, but the other part, the part that was changing and finding itself, felt he couldn't remain silent. "I was lost," Mark admitted, his voice firm yet calm. "Yes, I felt out of place for a long time, but now maybe I've found my way." The other doctor looked at him skeptically, shaking his head as if he were disappointed. "Do you really believe you'll find redemption in this, Mark?" Mark, without hesitating, replied, "It's not about redemption, it's about finding purpose, doing what I can with what I have, and honestly, I don't know why it took me so long to see that." The confrontation was brief, but the impact was profound. As he walked away from the hospital, Mark felt more secure in his choice. For the first time in a long while, he had spoken with conviction about who he was and what he wanted to do. The words of his former colleagues could no longer hurt him in the same way. He had found something bigger than their approval. He had found a new sense of purpose. Mark knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but as he looked to the future, he began to see hope, something he thought he had lost forever. He no longer needed validation from the medical world. He had chosen another path and was ready to move forward, with Caroline by his side. The community event was taking shape, but the process was slow and filled with uncertainty. Mark and Caroline were tireless, running back and forth to organize the final details. The small square in the center of the community, which had previously seemed deserted and lifeless, was beginning to transform. Some tables were set up to serve simple food and drinks, while a small makeshift stage, complete with an old microphone and a few benches, was assembled for anyone who wanted to speak or play music. Despite the preparations, the atmosphere was tense. Caroline, while adjusting one of the chairs, suddenly stopped and looked at Mark, her face showing a growing concern. "What if no one shows up?" she asked, the doubt finally spilling over. She tried to hide the fear in her voice, but Mark felt it. Mark, who was adjusting the lights on the stage, turned to her and took a deep breath. He felt the same fear, but he knew he couldn't let it show. Not now. "Then we'll do it for whoever comes," he replied with a forced calmness, crossing his arms. "Even if it's just the two of us." Caroline smiled, even though her heart raced with anxiety. The simplicity of Mark's response was comforting. It wasn't about how many people would come, but the meaning behind the event. They were there for those who needed to be heard. And if it was just one person, that was fine, even if it were just Julian. "You're right," she said, trying to convince herself. Mark looked around. The humble setup they had created contrasted with their expectations. It was a risk. Nothing guaranteed it would be a success, but there was beauty in trying, in exposing themselves to failure, because within that failure existed a greater purpose. For Mark, this was a new way of practicing his vocation. Perhaps it was less about saving lives and more about saving lost souls, including his own. While Mark and Caroline's anxiety focused on organizing the event, Julian was fighting a much more personal battle. That afternoon, he sat on the edge of the bed in the shelter, staring at the worn saxophone he had kept for years. His hands trembled, as if the mere act of holding the instrument brought back a part of himself he had buried along with his wife. There was a mix of fear and longing within him. When Caroline entered the room, she found her father completely absorbed in his thoughts, his gaze fixed on the instrument. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked softly, sitting down beside him. Julian didn't respond right away, merely shaking his head, still lost in the whirlwind of emotions that enveloped him. Finally, he looked at Caroline, his eyes filled with pain. "I'm not the man I used to be, Caroline." His voice came out low, heavy with years of suffering and regret. "They're going to hate me. They'll look at me and see a failure. How can I get up on that stage after everything I've done, after leaving everything and everyone behind?" Caroline felt a sharp pain in her chest seeing her father in that state. To her, he was still the man who once filled their home with music and love, despite all the adversities. She held his hands tightly, tears welling in her own eyes. "They won't hate you, Dad. They'll listen to you. They need to hear you." Her voice was firm yet filled with emotion. Julian turned away, battling the tears that threatened to escape. I don't know if I can," he murmured, his voice trembling. The fear of facing an audience that would judge him felt unbearable. The weight of his past still haunted him, and the stage, which had once been his refuge, now seemed like a battlefield. Caroline squeezed her father's hands tighter, trying to convey all the strength and love she had. "You can, yes, and you won't be alone. We'll all be there with you. I will be there." Her words were like a balm, but the fear still held him prisoner. In the days leading up to the event, Julian's tension seemed to increase with every passing moment. Caroline could see how he avoided talking about it, and whenever he looked at the saxophone, he appeared consumed by a whirlwind of emotions. She knew she would need more to convince him to face his fears, and she wasn't willing to give up. The night before the event, Caroline went back to the shelter. Julian was sitting by the window watching the city lights. He didn't seem like the man she knew anymore. It was as if, the closer they got to the event, the more he retreated into himself. Caroline sat down beside him without saying anything at first. The silence between them was heavy, but filled with a communication that needed no words. "Dad, I know you're scared," she finally said, her voice gentle yet firm. "And I know it's hard to imagine getting up on that stage after everything that's happened. But you have something that no one else has. You have your music, and you have Mom's memory." Julian remained silent, but Caroline knew she had touched something deep. He finally turned to her, his eyes filled with pain. "She's always been with me, in every note I played." Caroline nodded, her own emotions close to the surface. "And she's still with you, Dad. She'll be there tomorrow, just like she always has been. Every time you play, she'll be listening." Caroline's words resonated deeply within Julian. He closed his eyes as if trying to feel his wife's presence. "I miss her so much," he whispered, tears finally streaming down his face. "She was the only one who believed in me." "She still believes," Caroline replied, her own tears falling. "And I believe too. You don't have to be the man you were before, Dad. You just have to be who you are now, and that is enough." Julian nodded slowly, absorbing his daughter's words. The internal struggle between fear and hope was evident. He knew his wife's memory was a powerful force, but he also knew that the stage represented everything he had lost. Yet for the first time in a long time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, he could get up on that stage and play again. "I'll try," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "For her and for you?" Caroline smiled, holding her father's hands tightly. "That's all I ask." The day of the event had finally arrived, and the atmosphere in the small square was filled with a silent anticipation. Mark and Caroline arrived early to finalize the last details, but inside, both were consumed by anxiety. The square was set up with simple chairs, and a makeshift stage stood at the back, surrounded by modest decorations. Gradually, community members began to arrive, curious, but uncertainty still loomed over everyone. Caroline looked around, observing the few who had already taken their seats, while tension filled her chest. What if no one else comes?" she whispered to Mark, her eyes revealing the fear that everything they had planned might fail. So much was at stake, not just for Julian, but for all those who needed a chance to be heard. She knew how much it meant to her father, and the thought of him facing that empty stage made her nervous. Mark tried to hide his own insecurity, but his eyes betrayed the calm he was trying to convey. "Then we'll do it for those who are here," he replied softly, squeezing her shoulder. "Even if it's just for the two of us." There was a fragility in his voice, but also a serene determination. He understood that the size of the audience didn't matter. What mattered was that those stories were told, and Julian had a chance at redemption. As the hour drew closer, more people began to show up. Some were curious, others were neighbors who had heard about the event and decided to lend their support. Mark and Caroline exchanged glances, a mix of relief and nervousness coursing through them. When Julian's name was called to the stage, Mark instinctively took Caroline's hand. She looked at him, feeling the same fear and hope. They both knew this was a pivotal moment for everyone. Julian stepped onto the stage with hesitant steps. His figure seemed small and fragile under the makeshift lights, and the silence that enveloped the square was almost oppressive. The saxophone in his hands felt heavy, as if it carried years of pain and failure. He looked out at the audience, a mix of unfamiliar and familiar faces, and felt panic start to spread within him. For a moment he froze, his hands trembling as they held the instrument. From the back of the crowd, Caroline and Mark watched with racing hearts. The silence that filled the square felt endless, each second amplifying the tension in the air. Caroline nearly stood up, but Mark held her back, whispering, "Give him a moment, he'll find his way." Julian closed his eyes. The memory of his wife, when he used to play for her, flooded his mind with an intensity he hadn't expected. He could see her smile, hear her gentle laughter as she watched him play in their small apartment. She always said that his music could make people feel more than words ever could. Remembering her was painful, but at the same time, it was the only thing that gave him strength. Slowly, he brought the saxophone to his lips. The first sound that came out was hesitant, almost faltering, but he didn't stop. Closing himself off in his memory, Julian began to play the melody he always performed for his wife. The music flowed with a raw sincerity, tearing through the silence with notes that carried all the pain, love, and regret of his life. Each note felt like a confession, each pause a cry of longing. Tears began to stream down Julian's face, but he continued to play, diving deeper into the music than he ever had before. He wasn't playing for the audience anymore. He was playing for her, for the woman he loved, for the life he lost, and somehow, for the part of him that still needed to be saved. At first, the audience was motionless, almost in shock at the intensity of the performance. But then, a pair of hands began to clap slowly. Soon, others followed. The applause grew until it transformed into deafening support. Julian finished the song with trembling hands, his body exhausted, but his heart lighter than he remembered. He looked out at the audience, still incredulous at what had just happened. A shy smile spread across his face as he wiped away his tears. The applause continued, and for a moment he felt the silent triumph of someone who had finally found peace. After Julian's performance, the event took on a different atmosphere. The square, once filled with uncertainties, now vibrated with renewed energy. One by one, stories began to be shared. Homeless residents, often invisible to society, stepped onto the stage to share their journeys of pain and resilience. Some spoke with trembling voices, others with a firmer tone, but each account carried a raw truth that connected everyone present. A man who had lost everything to addiction recounted how he had spent years living on the streets, fighting to survive each day until he found the strength to rebuild his life. An elderly woman, her eyes weary, spoke about the family she lost and how loneliness had consumed her. Each story was a fragment of life, and the audience, now fully engaged, listened with attention and respect. Mark watched from a distance, his emotions close to the surface. Each word seemed to strike a part of his soul that he had kept locked away for too long. He recognized those stories of despair and struggle. He saw them reflected in his own journey, failure, loss, and the relentless search for a reason to keep moving forward. With each story told, he felt a weight in his chest, but at the same time, something within him began to break free. The tears he had tried to hold back finally fell. He did not hide them. In that moment, Mark realized that everything they had done, every effort, every night of doubt, had been worth it. It was no longer just about helping Julian or organizing a community event. It was about reconnecting with his own humanity, with his own pain and that of others. Caroline, beside Mark, held his hand. She knew how much that moment meant to him, how much it meant to them both. The event, which had begun as an attempt to give voice to others, was now connecting them in a way neither could have imagined. The atmosphere in the square felt almost sacred, as if everyone present had found a space where their pains and hopes mingled, creating something new, something healing. Mark looked at Caroline, and they exchanged a glance that needed no words. For the first time in a long while, he felt that he was finally part of something bigger than himself. And in that moment, he knew he was on the right path. The event had exceeded all expectations. The small stage, which once seemed so insignificant, was now the center of an unexpected transformation. People from all parts of the community, from all walks of life, were present, applauding, sharing, and, above all, listening. The silence that had enveloped the audience at the beginning had been replaced by a vibrant energy, a sense of unity that seemed to grow with each story told, with each note of music played. Mark and Caroline stood beside the stage, still absorbing everything happening around them. Success was not just measured by the number of attendees, but by the depth of connections being formed there. Mark felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. But it wasn't the pride of achieving a great medical feat or impressing colleagues. It was a humble pride, a sense of purpose that enveloped him with a calmness he had almost forgotten. As the event continued, Julian stepped down from the stage. The weight of years of suffering seemed to have dissipated, replaced by something new, something he thought he would never feel again. He walked towards Mark, and before he could say anything, he wrapped the doctor in a tight embrace. Mark, taken by surprise, hesitated for a moment before relaxing into Julian's arms. "Thank you, Mark," Julian whispered, his voice trembling but filled with emotion. "Thank you for believing in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself." Julian's words hit Mark hard, breaking down any emotional resistance he had been trying to maintain. He returned the hug with strength, feeling the sincerity of the gratitude. "I just gave you a chance," Mark replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You did the rest." The moment between them was brief but loaded with meaning. Julian, a man who had been lost, found redemption, and Mark, who had closed himself off from the world, began to find his way back to himself. When they pulled away, Julian looked at him, his expression lighter than at any moment since they met. It was a new beginning for both. The day after the event, Caroline showed up at Mark's apartment, a radiant smile on her face. The event had been a resounding success, and she felt that something inside her had also changed forever. Mark's support, his constant presence, and his encouraging words had finally given her the courage to make an important decision. "I have some news," Caroline said as she walked in, enthusiasm clear in her voice. Mark, sitting at the table, looked at her with curiosity. "Tell me." Caroline moved closer and sat beside him, her eyes shining with determination. "I signed up for a therapy course. I've decided that this is what I want to do." For a moment, Mark was silent, absorbing her words. Then a genuine smile lit up his face. "I always knew you'd be amazing," he said, admiration sincere in his voice. Caroline felt her heart race at those words. Mark's support had always meant a lot to her, but hearing that, spoken with such honesty, made her feel that the path she was about to take was even more right. "I wouldn't have done this without you, Mark. Everything we've been through made me realize that I can help people in a way I never imagined." Mark, moved, stood up and embraced her tightly. "You're going to change lives, Caroline. Just like you're already changing mine." They held each other for a moment, in a silent embrace, but filled with meaning. It was as if that hug sealed not only Caroline's decision, but also the bond they had built together. When they pulled away, there was a glimmer of hope in both their eyes. The future was uncertain, but they were no longer lost. Caroline had found her purpose, and Mark knew he had helped guide someone toward a better life. That, in itself, was already a victory. A few days later, Mark was sitting in the small park where he and Caroline used to walk and discuss plans for the event. He watched people pass by, children playing, families strolling, and felt a deep calmness washing over him. The clouds that had followed him for so long, those doubts that consumed him about his worth as a doctor and as a person, seemed to begin to dissipate. Caroline approached and sat down beside him, smiling. "Are you okay?" she asked, noticing Mark's thoughtful demeanor. He sat in silence for a few seconds, taking in the tranquility of the park before responding. "You know, I always thought my purpose in life was to save lives with a scalpel in my hands, as if my only value was as a surgeon." Caroline looked at him intently, sensing that he was about to share something important. "But now," Mark continued, his voice soft yet firm, "now I see that all I needed to do was listen. I thought medicine was about healing bodies, but what I've learned from you, from Julian, and from this event is that sometimes true healing comes from listening, from support, and from compassion." Caroline nodded slowly, Mark's words resonating deeply within her. "You are more than a surgeon, Mark. You're someone who sees people. And sometimes, that's what matters most." Mark looked at her, his eyes shining with an emotion he could barely contain. "I thought I was lost, that I had failed at everything that mattered. But now I see that perhaps what happened was exactly what I needed to find a new path. A path I would never have chosen before, but now seems to be the right one." The intensity of Mark's words moved Caroline, and she felt tears welling in her eyes. "I've always believed you would find your way, Mark, and I think now you finally have." Mark smiled, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. For the first time since his dismissal, he allowed himself to believe that his life hadn't ended that day. On the contrary, it was just beginning in a way he had never anticipated. He had found a new purpose, a new way to heal, not just others but himself. "Thank you for showing me this," Mark said, his voice soft but filled with emotion. Caroline smiled in response. "Thank you for helping me find mine too." And so, in that simple park, the two remained in silence, side by side, knowing that the path ahead would be filled with challenges, but also new possibilities. They had both found what they were searching for, a way to start anew. In the months that followed the community event, Mark found himself in a new phase of life, one he had never imagined. His actions, his presence at the event, and the stories he helped share resonated throughout the city, drawing the attention of other community groups and organizations also striving to assist the marginalized. Before he knew it, Mark began receiving invitations to speak at other events. At first, he hesitated to accept. He didn't see himself as a speaker, let alone someone capable of inspiring crowds. However, Caroline encouraged him to accept, convinced that his story could help others just as it had helped her. At the first event he spoke at, Mark was visibly nervous. As he stepped onto the stage, he felt the same sensations Julian had felt, the weight of expectations, the fear of not being enough. But when he looked out at the small audience waiting in silence, he realized something. Those people were there to listen, not to judge. Just as he had learned from Caroline and Julian, often the greatest gift we can give someone is simply to listen. Mark took a deep breath and began to tell his story. He spoke of his downfall, about how he had lost everything, not just his career, but also his identity, and how, for a time, he believed his life had lost all purpose. He spoke honestly about his doubts, his fears, and the profound loneliness that accompanied him. But he also spoke of reconnection, how he had found a new path by listening to the stories of those society had forgotten, and how that had healed him in ways he never imagined possible. As he spoke, he observed the audience's reactions. Some looked on with teary eyes, others nodded, as if they saw themselves in Mark's words. When he finished, the silence in the room lasted only a few seconds before being broken by warm applause. People approached him to express their gratitude, some sharing their own stories of downfall and redemption. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt that his voice, his words, had purpose. And that, more than any award or professional recognition, made him feel whole again. As time passed, the friendship between Mark and Caroline deepened in ways neither had anticipated. Their joint efforts to help Julian and other homeless individuals brought them closer together, creating a connection built not only on shared experiences, but also on a mutual understanding of their own vulnerabilities. They began to meet frequently, not just to discuss Julian's progress, but to talk about their own projects, hopes, and even fears. On a sunny afternoon, after yet another meeting to plan future community initiatives, Mark and Caroline decided to take a walk in the park near the shelter where Julian was recovering. The sun shone brightly, and a gentle breeze made the trees sway softly, creating a tranquil atmosphere. Their conversations flowed casually, but there was a slight tension in the air, something unspoken that manifested in the moments of silence between phrases. As they walked side by side, Caroline laughed at the sight of a child running across the lawn, her small bare feet kicking up dirt as she played tag with a playful dog. Caroline's laughter caught Mark's attention, and he found himself watching her, his eyes shining with something deeper than he usually allowed to be visible. For a brief moment their gazes met, and the silence that followed felt different. It wasn't awkward, but charged with something unspoken. Something they both felt but hadn't yet found the words to express. Mark hesitated for a second. He felt a sudden urge to say something, to express what was in his heart. But seeing Caroline smile at him shyly, almost as if she knew what he was thinking, he opted for silence. She quickly changed the subject, talking about a new idea she had for the next event, and Mark followed her lead. But what lingered between them remained present. Something more than mere friendship was there, growing, even if neither of them was ready to acknowledge it. As the friendship between Mark and Caroline flourished, Julian continued his recovery steadily. The impact of the community event had been transformative for him. Not only did it remind him of who he was before everything fell apart, but for the first time in many years, he felt he could again be the person he had always dreamed of being. One night, while Mark was visiting Julian at the shelter, they sat in the small room he occupied. Julian appeared more relaxed than usual, which made Mark realize something was different. There was a lightness in the air that he couldn't quite define at first. "There's something I need to tell you," Julian began, his voice carrying a hesitance that Mark rarely heard from him. Mark straightened in his chair, waiting for Julian to continue. The man looked at the saxophone leaning against the wall, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "I've always had a dream," he admitted. "A dream I never had the courage to pursue. Ever since I started playing, I've always wanted to record an album. But after my wife died, I let that idea die too." Mark fell silent for a moment, absorbing what Julian was saying. He knew how much music meant to Julian, how each note was a form of expression, a way to process the pain and joy of life. "And why didn't you?" Mark asked gently. Julian sighed. "Fear, perhaps. Fear of failing. Fear that the music without her wouldn't be good enough. I sabotaged myself before I even tried." Mark looked at him, a glimmer of understanding and encouragement in his eyes. He leaned slightly forward, speaking with a firm gentleness. "Maybe it's time to be brave, Julian. Maybe it's time to give yourself the chance to pursue that dream." Mark's words seemed to resonate deeply within Julian, who nodded slowly, as if the weight of the idea was still settling within him. "I don't know where to start," Julian admitted, but this time there was no fear in his voice, only a recognition that the dream was still there, latent, waiting for the right moment to be reborn. Mark smiled, reaching out his hand to Julian. "You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together." Julian's look of gratitude was enough for Mark to realize that this moment was more than just a conversation about music. It was about allowing oneself the permission to dream again, to embrace vulnerability, even when everything seemed lost. And as he left the shelter that night, Mark felt that he too was learning to be courageous in a new way. Mark and Caroline knew that supporting Julian in realizing his dream would be an intense journey, but they were determined to make it happen. The idea of recording an album seemed impossible at first, but slowly they began to gather the necessary elements. Mark, leveraging his new network of contacts in the communities, found local musicians willing to collaborate, all touched by Julian's story. Some were young and full of talent. Others were veterans of New York's music scene who understood the transformative power of music. The studio they secured was modest but suitable. Upon walking in for the first time, Julian fell silent, his eyes scanning the space. For him, that place represented more than just a recording venue. It was a chance to reconnect with something he thought he had lost forever. However, the pressure felt overwhelming. The saxophone, which once was an extension of his soul, now felt like a burden. Julian looked at Caroline and Mark, trying to mask his insecurities, but they could see the conflict in his eyes. Caroline, always sensitive to her father's emotional state, encouraged him with an encouraging smile. "We're here with you, Dad. This is just the beginning." Mark nodded, placing a firm hand on Julian's shoulder. "You've overcome so much to get here, Julian. We're going to do this together." Even with their supportive words, Julian struggled with his own doubts. He felt the weight of past failures and the fear of not meeting the expectations he had imposed on himself. The pressure of pursuing a dream long delayed left him restless. As the musicians tuned their instruments and the technicians prepared the studio, Julian stared at the saxophone in his hands, questioning whether he could still play with the same passion and skill as before. The excitement in the studio was palpable, but for Julian each passing second heightened his internal tension. The fear of failing again lurked nearby, and he didn't know if he had the strength to face it. The first attempts at recording were difficult. Julian struggled to find the rhythm. The notes seemed to dissipate in the air before reaching his heart. The time he had spent away from music had left him rusty, but it wasn't just that. His internal demons, the memories of his wife, the guilt over his downfall, the long journey back to sobriety, were all present, weighing on him every time he tried to play. On the third day of recording, after several consecutive failures, Julian took off the headphones and stepped away from the saxophone, his breathing heavy and his hands trembling. "I can't do this. It's not working," he said, his voice fragile. "Maybe I was never good enough. Maybe I've just been fooling myself all these years." Mark and Caroline exchanged worried glances. They knew this moment would come. Julian was confronting the ghosts of his past, the self-sabotage that had previously held him back from pursuing his dreams. Mark stepped closer to Julian, his voice calm yet firm. "Julian, listen. You've already faced the worst. You've been at rock bottom, and yet here you are, standing strong. Recording this album is just the beginning of your rebirth, not the end. Every note you play now carries the strength of everything you've overcome." Julian looked at him, doubts filling his eyes, but something in Mark's words struck a chord. Caroline, coming up on the other side, held her father's hand. "You've accomplished so much already. Now is the time to do this for you, Dad. Let the music flow again." Julian closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He knew this process was about more than just technique. It was about forgiving himself, accepting his past, and embracing the present. After a few seconds of silence, he put the headphones back on and prepared to try again. Mark and Caroline watched in silence, sensing that this was a pivotal moment. Slowly, Julian brought the saxophone to his lips, and this time, when he began to play, there was something different. The notes weren't perfect, but they were filled with soul. Each mistake, each hesitation became part of the journey, and Julian began to accept them. The music started to take shape. The musicians around him felt the change and intensified their accompaniment. The recording continued, and gradually the album began to come to life. Finally, the day of the final recording arrived. The atmosphere in the studio was one of anticipation but also of nervousness. Everyone knew this was the decisive moment. Julian looked visibly shaken, his anxiety growing as he approached the microphone. He had managed to overcome the initial difficulties, but now, the pressure to finalize the project felt more intense than ever. Caroline, sitting in a chair beside Mark, watched her father with concern. She knew how much this meant to him, and how he feared that everything might fall apart at the last moment. Mark noticed Julian's increasing nervousness and, rising to his feet, walked over to him. "Remember, Julian," he said softly, "this isn't about being perfect. It's about telling your story through your music. Just play. Let everything else happen naturally." Julian looked at Mark and Caroline, and for a moment he felt a warm reassurance in their gazes. They had been with him from the beginning, supporting him unconditionally. This support fortified him in ways he never imagined possible. He took a deep breath, adjusted the microphone, and sat at the piano, an instrument he hadn't touched since his wife's death. When his fingers first touched the keys, he hesitated, but then, closing his eyes, he let the music take over. The sound that filled the studio was of such deep and sincere beauty that the silence that followed seemed to reverberate off the walls. Each note carried a piece of his soul, his journey, his losses, and his hopes. Julian lost himself in the music, playing with an intensity that left everyone in the studio in a state of silent reverence. The sound engineers, the musicians, and even Caroline and Mark, who watched from the control room, were deeply moved. When the last note of the piano echoed through the studio, there was complete silence. Julian, with his hands still on the keys, took a deep breath and slowly opened his eyes, feeling tears streaming down his face. "I did it," he whispered, his voice laden with relief and emotion. The words barely escaped his lips, but the smile that broke across his face was as clear as day. He had done what he had never believed possible. Julian had found the courage to face his demons and fulfill a lifelong dream. Mark and Caroline, on the other side of the glass wall, exchanged glances, both with misty eyes. It was the end of one journey, but also the beginning of another, filled with new possibilities and, above all, a new life for Julian. The recording was almost finished, and the atmosphere in the studio was a mix of concentration and satisfaction. Julian, still recovering from the emotion of his last piano session, sat next to Mark and Caroline, all absorbed in the moment of silent triumph. The studio door, which usually creaked slightly when opened, made its familiar sound, but no one expected it to be anything more than a technician returning to make an adjustment. When the door opened completely, a woman stepped in, her curious eyes immediately captured by the soft music still echoing through the walls. It was Claire Donovan, a former college mate of Mark, now a well-known music producer in the New York scene. Mark, initially distracted, took a few seconds to realize who had walked in. He suddenly stood up, surprised by Claire's unexpected presence. "Claire? What are you doing here?" She smiled, clearly impressed with what she heard and saw. "I was passing by to visit some musicians and couldn't resist when I heard this incredible music coming from the studio." Her eyes then turned to Julian, who, still trying to grasp what was happening, looked at her cautiously. "Was that you playing?" she asked directly, and Julian merely nodded shyly, still processing the presence of someone who seemed so far from his world. "His name is Julian," Mark said, visibly proud. "He's recording an album, something he's dreamed of for a long time." Claire, clearly impressed, walked towards Julian, her eyes sparkling with a mix of admiration and professional excitement. "Julian, I hear dozens of musicians every week, but something in your music, it has a raw sincerity that is rare. I would love to help you launch this album, give it the visibility it deserves." The shock on Julian's face was immediate. He looked at Mark and Caroline, unable to process the offer he had just received. I don't even know what to say," he murmured, trying to hold back the emotion rising to the surface. Before tears could fall, he stood up and embraced Mark and Caroline tightly. Gratitude overflowed from each gesture. "Thank you for never giving up on me." The moment was one of pure happiness and fulfillment. They all knew that this moment represented more than just an album being recorded. It was a life being rebuilt, an old dream finally taking shape. With Claire's offer and the recording completed, the next steps for the album's release began to unfold. However, at that moment, with the musicians and engineers busy finalizing the last technical details, the studio was calm. Mark and Caroline sat alone in the control room, watching through the glass window as Julian familiarized himself with some of the recording equipment. The comfortable silence between them allowed both to reflect on how much their lives had changed. Mark, sitting next to Caroline, watched her in silence, a mix of emotions washing over his heart. He thought about everything they had been through together, the struggle to help Julian, the personal challenges each had faced, and how, somehow, it had united them in a way he never expected. For a moment he hesitated, gathering courage, but something inside him knew it was the right time. Without saying anything, Mark reached out, hesitantly touching Caroline's hand. She looked at him, surprised, but with a gentle smile on her face. The touch was simple, yet loaded with meaning. They exchanged a deep look, where their entire journey, the pains, the victories, and the shared moments, seemed to converge. "I don't know how I would have gotten through all this without you," Mark said, his voice soft, filled with emotion. He knew those words were true. Caroline had not only helped him find a new purpose, but had also become his emotional anchor, the person who kept him steady when he was on the verge of giving up. Caroline squeezed Mark's hand gently, her eyes shining. "You were never alone in this, Mark. I was always here." Her voice was a whisper, but it was filled with sincerity. And at that moment they both knew that the bond they had formed was more than just friendship. The silence that followed was thick, charged with unspoken feelings finally finding space to be expressed. Slowly, Mark leaned in towards Caroline, their gazes locked until their lips finally met in a tender, sincere kiss. The gesture, both delicate and profound, sealed everything they had built together. Not just the support they had given Julian, but also the love that had blossomed between them throughout the journey. When they pulled apart, both smiled, knowing that the path they had traveled together had led them to something deeper and more lasting. The launch of Julian's album was an event that brought together not only the community he lived in, but also people from different parts of the city, all touched by the story of redemption and overcoming adversity that accompanied it. The event was held in the same square where Mark and Caroline had organized their first community event, a symbolic circle from where it all began. The square was lit up, and people gathered around the stage where Julian would perform some tracks from the album. The energy in the air was one of celebration, but also of deep gratitude. Julian, now visibly more confident and at peace with himself, walked onto the stage with his saxophone, greeted by a standing ovation from the crowd. He began to play the first song from the album. The notes filled the air, laden with emotion, and each person in the audience seemed to feel the weight of that journey, as if the music were a bridge connecting past pain to future hope. Mark and Caroline stood in the center of the crowd, holding hands. As they watched Julian play, Caroline turned to Mark, her eyes shining with joy and fulfillment. "We did it," she said softly, a smile lighting up her face. Mark looked at her, squeezing her hand firmly. "Yes," he replied, his heart full of gratitude. "We did." When Julian finished his last song, the square erupted in applause, and he, now surrounded by cheers and affection, smiled with genuine happiness, something he hadn't felt in many years. He stepped down from the stage, still emotional, and was welcomed by Mark and Caroline in a warm embrace. Their journey, marked by pain, hope, and love, was now complete. It wasn't the end, but the beginning of a new phase where, together, they formed a new family. A family born not of blood, but of shared overcoming, compassion, and the deep connection they found amid the chaos. Julian looked at Mark and Caroline, and with eyes full of gratitude, he simply whispered, "Thank you." Mark and Caroline, still wrapped around him, knew that those words were unnecessary, for the feeling of fulfillment and love that bound them spoke louder than any thank you could express. In the end, the doctor not only rediscovered the purpose he thought he had lost, but also realized that true healing doesn't always come from a scalpel. By risking everything for a simple act of compassion, he rebuilt his life and helped others do the same. The visit from the daughter of the man he saved not only brought a request, but also an opportunity for redemption. This journey shows us that sometimes the greatest impact we can have comes in the most unexpected moments. Are we willing to sacrifice what we hold most dear to help someone? And if we do, what does that say about who we really are? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any new content. Leave a like, comment your thoughts, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. And don't forget to click on the final card to watch the next recommended video. Thank you so much for being with us.